I'd like to welcome everybody into this morning's webinar where we're going to spend some time talking about starting new tickets and working with customers and vehicles. Before we begin, a couple of notes that I want to make sure that we add to the conversation, and that is we are working with what we're calling Gen 2 of our writer, specifically the version 2.1.63. But as we go through the webinar, you're going to see that this is using the later or latest release version of Gen 2. We're hosting this webinar as of February 1st of 2018, and this is now available in general release. If you'd like to inquire about getting updated, if you're still on what we're calling Gen 1, then you're more than welcome to reach out to our support team to ask about getting put on the schedule for an upgrade from Gen 1 to Gen 2. Now, important to note, if you're on what we call Gen 1 versus Gen 2, the first thing would be, how do I differentiate, or how can I tell? The very easy way to tell is what you're going to see with Gen 2 is that the color scheme has changed. We're now looking at shades of gray and blue for the most part. If you're looking at what we call Gen 1, you'll see yellows and greens and blues as well. However, the icons across the top and down the left are going to be more colorful in nature, as well as the screens inside of the estimate and work in progress window. So that's your very easy visual cue, is the color scheme. If you're seeing the grays and the blues, that's Gen 2. If you're seeing, again, yellows and blues, then that's going to be Gen 1. If you're on Gen 1, then I don't want you to dismiss the webinar that we're going to host this morning as not being relevant, because the functionality or the changes between Gen 1 and Gen 2 are minimal in terms of a learning curve, meaning we've made some upgrades, we've added some new features to Gen 2, and we'll see a couple of those as we go through this morning's webinar, some changes that are there. I'll point those out as we go along. However, the baseline functionality, a very common theme and workflow of our writer, doesn't change dramatically from Gen 1 to Gen 2. So again, I'll encourage you, whether you're using what we're calling Gen 1 or Gen 2, to continue on with the webinar. Again, it's got relevance in both cases as we go through. So with that as the preamble, we're going to go ahead and jump into the conversation. So as we're talking about starting new tickets, working with customers and vehicles, what we're really talking about is up here at the top of the screen, I've got two icons on my toolbar, new repair order, new estimate, and these would be ways that we could go ahead and start a new ticket. We'll finish up our conversation with the last or the third option there where it says phone quote today, but primarily looking at new RO and new EST. Now, I've got both buttons turned on. If you were with me with the previous webinar where we talked about configuring our toolbars, you're familiar with the fact that you can turn on or off icons for either a new estimate or a new repair order, and it is at your discretion over on the configuration side of life. But in my case, if we're going to start an estimate for a customer, we'll use the new EST button. As we begin, there's really three different scenarios as far as customers and vehicles are concerned. So I was going to go ahead and start a new estimate. I'll click on the new EST button, and it brings me to my search window. Now again, for those of you that are using what we call Gen 1 of our writer, what you'll notice is we've laid out the screens a little bit differently, and you're going to see that with some consistency through this morning's presentation. Again, what we've done with Gen 2 is we've cleaned up the screens a little bit, try to make them a little bit more user-friendly. But as we go to search our existing database, we've really got three different options, meaning in the upper left-hand corner, and the most common one like we use would be to search by the customer's name. Let's say I'd like to find a customer whose last name is Smith, or if I wanted to search for a phone number, and I could do it either 7 or 10 digits using the area code, and or if I wanted to search for all customers in a particular zip code. Again, most commonly the name search if we're doing customers, and in this case, again, it's last name, or you could do last name, comma, space, first name, if you really wanted to filter that list down a little bit further. The second way would be by vehicle information, and specifically license, VIN, or if you do a lot of fleet work, we could search for the fleet unit number. So again, in the top section, we're telling it to look for this license plate, or this VIN number, or the fleet unit number. I said three different ways to search because the third way, it's also under our vehicle information screen, but you'll notice we segregated down here to the bottom where you could say I'm looking for this specific year, make, and model. So I know this vehicle has been in before, and I'd like to try to find it. Maybe I've misspelled the customer's name. Maybe it was a different customer that brought in the same vehicle, but you can tell it to search for year, make, and model as well. In our case, we're going to start out by doing a customer search. So again, we're looking for last name. And if I wanted to do last name, I could do just the last name, and or if I wanted to do last and first, I would have to do comma, space, and then start to type the first name as we went through. As I go ahead and do my search, in our case, we're searching for customers whose last name is Johnson, and it gives me a list of all the different customers whose last name starts with the consecutive characters of John-Son. I say it like that only because we could do a partial search, meaning if I just typed in John, it doesn't search for the exact string match. It says I'm looking for anything that starts with John as a search parameter. So in this case, once we do our search, it comes up and it tells us that we have 21 different customers in our database that match the search string. In this case, John as the beginning characters of that customer's last name. And it displays to us not just customer name, but address, phone, whether it's their, in my case, cell phone number, and then also city and state and zip for each individual customer. Down here towards the bottom, to move forward from this window, handful of different options or icons that I've got down there. Cancel, as you might infer, is going to just take us back out of this window back over to our writer. The back button takes me back one screen to my search screen, so I could type in a different search parameter if I hadn't found what I was looking for. Central Service Lookup is for our customers that are using our Central Service cloud-based reporting tool. So if I had multiple locations, what Central Service Lookup would allow me to do would be to say, well, I want to look at not just my location, but I've got store 2 and store 3 that are also sending information up to Central Service. I'd like to see if I could pull that customer information down from Central Service as opposed to from my local database. We're going to get back to starting a new customer here a bit later on. And then last but not least, when I click on OK, it's going to accept the customer that we've picked and continue on to the vehicle screen. Now, one last option here, you'll notice there's a checkbox there that says parts only ticket. If you're a location that does a lot of over-the-counter parts sales, what we'd likely recommend you do is you add in icons up here to the top for a parts estimate or a parts invoice. Again, we talked about configuring this toolbar in our previous webinar. We can add additional icons there, and or if I just needed to do a parts only ticket one time, after I select my customer, I could check the box there. What it then does is it bypasses the vehicle screen. It says, well, for a parts only ticket, I just need to know who I'm selling that to, not necessarily on what vehicle they're going to install. So in our case, I'm going to select the second one down in my list, and from here, there's really 3 ways that we continue forward. Either hit the Enter key on your keyboard, double-click on the line we've selected, or click on OK. Any of the 3 will execute the same thing, essentially clicking the OK button and taking us to the window that follows. In this case, we've got one vehicle that has been in for service from Constance Johnson in our history. It's a 2010 Ford Escape. We've got our VIN license if there was a fleet unit number associated. And then last but not least, there's our customer name. And if I wanted to go ahead and continue with this vehicle, all I do is I click on OK in the lower right-hand corner. It's going to take us forward there. In my case, I've got a configurable parameter turned on where it's asking me to enter in a mileage. When I say a configurable parameter, what I mean is whether or not this window appears and how it behaves is user definable. We're going to do another webinar a little bit later on about some of the configurable options as it relates to customers and vehicles. We'll talk about where this comes in and or how we modify the settings here inside of that webinar a bit later on today. Now in this case, it's got my previous mileage was 120,504. If I wanted to leave that where it was for now until we're done with our inspections and get an updated mileage, I could just click on OK. If I'd like to put in a different mileage, well, our friend Constance told us she's got about 125,400 miles, and all I do is I type in that value and then click on OK. So we've selected our customer, we've selected our vehicle, and it now takes us into what's called our Service Requests tab. Now there are 2 different tabs that you can land on as you start a new estimate or repair order inside of our writer. Again, a configurable setting, but you'll notice down here at the bottom, we've got my Service Request tab, and I've got my Parts and Labor tab. So again, we can define which one of these we start on. In some cases, if you're not using the Service Requests tab, then I'm adding an extra click to your life by making you start on this first tab here. So again, a configurable setting we'll take a look at in our webinar later this afternoon. For those of you that are on Gen 1, you're going to notice a little bit of a different look to this window here. Again, as we talked about Gen 1 versus Gen 2, there are some differences in functionality. Again, we've cleaned up some screens. In this case, the difference is, used to be that you had 6 different checkboxes that went across in this services section. They would allow me to add on a new service request or a new job onto a transaction. They were used for your most commonly used inspection items. And the request as we went to Gen 2 was to expand that from 6 to allow more. Maybe it was 8, 10, 12. The way that we've modified this is we now give you an opportunity to define as many different quick jobs or services as you would like. So again, if you wanted 6, 8, 12, 20, then again, you would just have a scroll bar here as you add those additional elements on. One other piece, and that is we've also added the ability to automatically default one of these jobs to automatically add on to a transaction, as opposed to me having to click on the courtesy check and hit post labor. If that's going to be a standard of service with every transaction, it can be defaulted to always come onto a ticket as we begin. Again, as we talk about starting a new estimate and some of the configuration related elements there, we'll look at a little bit of the difference here now with Gen 2 and what we see with our service requests as we go on. So as we finish up the concept of starting a brand new transaction, again, as we're in the service request window, the purpose of this window really is to facilitate the customer intake process. Why did the customer stop by to see us in this instance? So again, I can capture any notes that I'd like. As I'm typing in notes, if I want to make sure that those get committed to this transaction, when I'm done typing, I can hit save on the left-hand side. What you're going to notice is my flashing cursor goes away. That's my visual cue that I have clicked on save as we went through. Depending on how well you can type, you could use spell check to make sure that you've correctly spelled all of the different elements that we've included, and or in this drop-down box at the top where it says customer requests, you can define a pre-established list of the most common requests that you hear from customers as they come through the door. Again, in my case, I've got about 20 or 25 different elements in my list here. If I wanted, I could drop that down, only have a couple, or I could have much more. It is user definable. As we look at the customer request drop-down, I typically give people 2 primary reasons why we would use this. The first would be if you had some standard verbiage that you wanted to appear. So I want this sentence, this paragraph, this text to always be added on, then using that drop-down box is a fairly easy way to make sure that that gets included, and it's included with the syntax, the spelling, and the grammar that you'd like as we put it on there. The second would be, if I don't have guys that are necessarily proficient at spelling and or typing, I could say, well, let's see, as opposed to using the typing in the box down here, I'd like to just add in my front brakes squeak and squeal. And when I select that from my list there, I have to click on add request. And then now it drops that text in there. And again, I've got one line. You could certainly have considerably more in terms of the amount of text that you would enter. So the drop down box is there if you find purpose to it in real life, meaning people that are actually using it front counter, they'll typically type in only because every customer describes their symptoms or conditions a little bit different. So again, you've got the ability to just type in whatever you'd like as we go through. So again, down here in the lower left-hand corner, you've got a section that says services. If you're on Gen 1, you'll find these to just be 6 boxes that you can check moving left to right in columns of 2. You check those and then you click on post labor. And what that then does is it adds on to my parts and labor tab whatever labor job we've got that tied to in the background. Again, with Gen 1, we can add up to 6 different quick items, most typically meant for inspections. With Gen 2, we have a little bit more opportunity to include beyond just the original 6. Last but not least, on the right-hand side where it says times, here's the time the customer walked through the door, or really it's the time that we hit the new EST button. And whether or not we have promised them at a specific time. If we've promised it, then we can define what time we've promised the customer. In this case, if we said, well, we promised that it would be done at 5 p.m. this evening, and or if they're waiting, if I click on promised and I add that in there, once I close it, what we'll find is into my estimates in progress, we've added a new estimate for Constance Johnson for her Ford Escape. There's our time in. Now you'll notice in my column set, I don't have promise time turned on. If I'm using that, Well, then now we want to make sure that we have that column turned on so I can see exactly when it's been promised. A little more about configuring those windows in that previous webinar, where we talk a little more about the screens and the layouts as we go through. So, all right, so that was a new customer with an existing customer with an existing vehicle. Let's go through a couple more scenarios. So with a new estimate, in this case, the customer's last name is Thomas. And as I search, there's Jackie Thomas. And if we want to go ahead and select Jackie, we can either click on OK. Only vehicles she's had in for service is a 95 Buick LeSabre. Not still on the road. She's brought a new vehicle in to see us today. So in this case, I'm going to hit New Vehicle, lower right-hand corner. There's really three different ways that we can enter in vehicle information. When I say that, a couple of them are dependent on exactly what subscriptions you have and or what catalog integrations you're using. We'll start with, down here at the bottom, you'll notice my cursor is flashing in my vehicle section. And again, for those of you that are on Gen 1 versus Gen 2, this window laid out in a little bit of a different or more logical manner, but the new piece is this little thing here that says ACES. I'll finish up my conversation with an explanation of what that is as we go along. But as we're defining the vehicle, again, the first way we could go through it is we could just put in the vehicle information. We can either type in our year. Now we got 06. Now we have vehicles that were manufactured before the turn of the century. What it does is if I typed in, let's say 1999 or just 99 as a string, it changes the first two characters to a 19. The way that behaves is if you put in any characters 30 through 99, it'll default to 19, 00 to 29, then it'll default to 2000 as the year. I put in my year, and then if I was to use either my drop-down box, or if I went down to the make field and I clicked on the F key, in this case, it's keeping track, or it's following along alphabetically with what we're typing, in this case, Ford, as the make as we go through. Again, click on my next drop-down, or again, I hit the Tab key on the keyboard. If I hit the T key, now it recognizes that a Taurus was the first alphabetical make from Ford in 2006. And as I continue on down, next would be the engine size. With the engine size, as I'm typing it in, my recommendation is, as opposed to just typing in the characters, use the up and down arrows or the drop-down box, either one. Again, what you'll notice is there's a fairly specific naming convention that, depending on what catalog interface I'm using, gets associated. So if I just typed in 3.0 or 3L for a 3-liter engine, the catalog wouldn't recognize it, and I'd be forced to re-enter the information if I was going out to search for parts and labor. So again, engine size, and then if you wanted, you can enter a transmission as well. Year, make, model, and engine are vital, meaning as we go to search catalogs for whether it's parts, whether it's labor, whether it's diagnostic and repair information, all of that information is absolutely critical. The transmission is primarily for notation purposes, meaning when I go to print a copy of a document, it'll show that this is the transmission that we associated with that vehicle. If I'm out in, let's say, the Epicor or Smart ECAD interfaces, and I'm looking for parts and or labor, and there's a variance based upon automatic or manual transmission, it'll present me with either an option and or both, so that I can select the appropriate one for a particular vehicle. So I said three different ways that we could put in the vehicle information. The first one would be to go ahead and just enter in my year, make, model, and engine as we go along. The second would be using the VIN number. Now, in my case, I'm going to not display my stellar typing skills by typing in a VIN number, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy and paste one because I've got one on a notepad over here on the right-hand side. But if you got the VIN number into the system, what you'll notice is there's this icon over here on the right. It looks like two little cars, one left, one right next to another. When I click on that icon there, what it does is it reaches out to the Epicor catalog. So if you're an Epicor catalog subscriber, you can use the Vin decoding functionality. That tells you that that VIN belongs to a 1992 Isuzu Rodeo with a 3.1-liter engine. So again, we can use the VIN decoding functionality as I started down the path of the conversation of the different ways to resolve a vehicle. I had said that they're at least in part dependent on your subscriptions and or the modules of ROIDer that you're using. So in this case, my vehicle entry piece is going to be at least being able to decode the VIN dependent on whether or not I'm subscribing to the Epicor catalog. That's actually Epicor's VIN decoder that we're using underneath the scenes. So again, we can use the VIN number to get there. We often get asked, well, could I use a scanner to go out and get the VIN? The answer to that question is yes. Again, certainly depending on your proximity to the vehicle, you may need more than just a corded scanner, maybe a Bluetooth or a scanner with a memory chip inside. But you can absolutely walk out, scan that VIN number, and it would come back in here and populate that VIN field as we're sitting there. For those of you that are using what we call RO Touch, which is our app-based version for tablets and smartphones, you can go out with your tablet or your smartphone, take a picture of the VIN and have it start the vehicle directly or decode the VIN directly from that picture with your smartphone and or tablet. As I get back in here, we're going to wipe out the VIN number as well as the year, which will take out my make, model, and engine. Then come back in here to where it says license. Because the third way we could go ahead and resolve the vehicle would be to go ahead and enter in a license plate. So if I put in a license plate, there's a button down here that says VIN Lookup. Now this particular plate is registered in the state of Illinois. So when I go ahead and change my state and then click on VIN Lookup, this is using what we call our Carfax Quick VIN integration. So we're passing that license and that plate, the license plate and state out to Carfax, who is telling us that based upon their records, it's registered to the vehicle with this VIN, which is a 2014 Ford Explorer. So once we go ahead and click on OK, yes, because it asks us, is this correct? It's going to then enter in year, make, model, and then potentially the engine. I say potentially the engine because, again, it's going to either use the Epicor VIN decoding piece to figure out what year, make, model, and engine that VIN would have been relative to, and or if you're not using Epicor, you can still use the Carfax integration. However, it'll only populate what information comes back from Carfax. So this is not dependent on Epicor. However, it is dependent on being a subscriber to what we call our Carfax or Quick VIN functionality. If either the Epicor catalog or the Quick VIN functionality is not part of your current RO writer, you're more than welcome to reach out, or I'd encourage you to reach out to your sales rep to talk about getting one and or both added to your subscription. One other note, this functionality is exactly the same on Gen 1 as it is Gen 2. So no changes to the behavior of anything that we've talked about to this point as it relates to the vehicle window. Now we're going to change that comment slightly because there is a new function with Gen 2 that exists. It's called ACES. So for those of you that are familiar with industry standards, there used to be a standard for vehicle identification called the AAIA standard. It has been replaced in the last couple of years by what's called the ACES standard. Both AAIA and ACES are acronyms. I won't go through what they actually stand for, but again, they're essentially standards for resolving year, make, model, and engine. In our writer, the difference is if we're using SmartyCat and or the Epicor catalog interfaces, they're going to use the Epicor resolution for year, make, model, and engine. If we're using any of our repair guides or some of the other catalog interfaces, they're going to use the ACES standards to identify the vehicle. So in this case, if I wanted to with ACES, I could identify, in this case, it's the base model. With the base model, we have the 2-liter or the 3.5, 3.5-liter engine. It tells us that this is what vehicle we're now looking for now that we've resolved it to the ACES standard. Transmission is still the same. We can still identify the transmission, although in this case, we do get that information coming from ACES, so there is relevance to it, as opposed to on the other side with the Epicor, where I told you that there was not, other than a notation field, a relevance to the transmission. So now that you notice both of them are in blue, we have resolved the vehicle both to the Epicor standard and to the ACES standard. So regardless of which catalog integrations we're using, then it's going to recognize year, make, model, and engine as we go through. I'm going to click on OK, and then from there it takes us into our service requests tab, where we can go ahead and we can start down the path of entering in our comments from our customer and our inspection items. A couple last pieces as we finish up this morning's conversation. We haven't done a new estimate for a new customer with a new vehicle. So in this case, if I came back in here and I said, okay, let's look for customer's last name is Wilson, and I don't have a particular customer inside of the system whose name is Wilson, or I'm sorry, we're looking for my customer, Mr. Jeff Wilson. One other quirk or feature that's fairly well hidden, most folks don't know that it exists, is we can do what's called a wildcard search. Customer's first name is Jeff. So you know what, maybe we spelled his last name wrong when he was in previously. So let's search for, in this case, we'll put an asterisk in front and then just the letters J-E-F. And when I do my search, what you're going to notice is it found J-E-F as long as it existed somewhere, whether it was at the front, whether it was in the middle, if you will, and or at the back end. And so it shows us here's everybody with the consecutive characters of J-E-F in their name. When you put the asterisk in, it does, again, what's called a wildcard search. For those of you that are familiar with using wildcard searches, you typically would have to put that asterisk in front and in back. In this case, just putting it in the front actually does the wildcard search through the entire character string. No need to put it on the back side. So again, in this case, still need to create a new customer. So I'm going to click on New Customer in the lower right-hand corner. Because we did search for the customer with an asterisk, that becomes what it populates into our last name field. But in this case, we'll say Jeff is the first, and then Wilson is the last. One of the other things you'll notice with Gen 2, and this is a configurable setting, is you can either allow it to do mixed case or all uppercase. Gen 1 will default and do all uppercase for customer and address information. Gen 2 gives us an opportunity to do mixed case if we'd like. So first name, last name, if you don't have a business name that's applicable, just leave that blank. The business name is actually the field that we search against. So I put in that it was ABC Delivery, that this vehicle was the business that this vehicle was associated with. That would be the parameter we'd search for next time they came in. Again, difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2 here is just the way the screens are laid out. Everything else is exactly the same. We've tried to give them a little bit more real estate and a little bit more logical order than we saw in Gen 1. We put in the customer information. Now his address goes down here. And in this case, we're going to default our city to my shop's location in 33412 Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. We'll talk about how we not only define where that default is, but also modify and or update if there's any zip codes that change or area codes that are associated that need to go through. 6 different phone numbers, and you can have them defined as you'd like. In my case, the first number in my system, the most common one I get from customers, is a cell number. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put in that cell number. You'll notice that I had those all lit up in red as we started. When we require a phone number, it requires us to put 7 characters in one of the phone number fields. It doesn't require us to put phone numbers in all 6 fields. So as soon as I entered in 7 characters, that fulfills the requirement of having a phone number. So therefore, that requirement now from red to black because it has been fulfilled. To the right, there's checkboxes that say primary. Again, these exist on Gen 1. Their purpose is when we go to print an estimate, a repair order, or an invoice, we print 2 different phone numbers. That's all the real estate that we have up there in the customer section. We will not print all 6. By default, we print what we call phone 1 and phone 2. So if you do nothing at all with these checkboxes on the right-hand side, then phone 1 and phone 2 will be the ones that print. If for a particular customer you wanted to print, let's say, phone 1 and phone 3, if I check the box where it says primary on the 3rd phone number down, then when it goes to print, it says, well, I've only got one that's got a check mark in it, so therefore I'm going to print the first one and the 3rd one. If I said, well, let's print the 3rd and the 4th, then what I could do is I could go ahead and I could tell the system I'd like to print the 4th one as we go along. A little quirk or nuance or difference with Gen 2, we're selecting or which one we want to be the primary as we go along. Down in the lower right-hand corner where it says email, you can fill in a customer's email address. So if you wanted to send them an email of an estimate and or a repair order, you could go ahead and fill that email in. And so if I put in jeff@yahoo.com, what you'll notice is once we get to what would appear to be the standard syntax for an email address, then it lights up that checkbox on the right-hand side that says send, and then to the right, there's an option there to save and send email. Concepts would be the send box says, well, let's see, I'm going to use this as part of my marketing effort. So if you're using the marketing and follow-up modules, and it sees that there's an email address and that checkbox there that says send is checked, then it'll use that email address. The customer says, well, I'll give you my email address so you can email me my invoice, but don't send me any marketing or promotional materials. So using the marketing module inside of our writer, it would not use an email address if that send box was unchecked. The button to the right that says save and send email is designed so that as I enter an email address. Maybe I want to just send them a welcome or a thank you for giving us your email address message. I can do that directly through that icon there on the right-hand side. Once I click on OK on Jeff Wilson, now it takes me into my vehicle window. So again, the same concept or functionality we saw just a moment ago. We'll put in year, make, model, and then now we can go ahead and click on OK to continue to our estimate window. That brings me to the end of my conversation this morning about starting new tickets, working with customers and vehicles.